Hey everyone, welcome back to HFI Covenant. My name is Jennifer and I'll be narrating today's story. This is a completely original human-written work of science fiction. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's jump right in. The skiff's active dampeners were engaged, masking its thermal and radar signatures, but they couldn't fully compensate for the physical tremor in the port vane. Over the Oakhaven frontier, following the thermal ridge that rolled off the red clay plateau, and Nayland kept it that way on purpose. She had learned, over the course of a century spent surveying the outer systems, that the most interesting data was collected before a subject knew they were being observed. The colony of Oakhaven spread below her in a loose cluster of prefab structures and cultivated rows, anchored to the land the way old things were anchored, through repetition, through maintenance, through the daily act of refusing to be displaced. The hegemony's cartographic records listed it as a Class 4 Death World settlement, which meant the soil was high density, the fauna was aggressive, and the humans who lived there were built accordingly. Nayland had surveyed 41 such worlds. She had taken meticulous notes on all of them. She had found none of them particularly surprising. Then she saw him. He was on a ridge above the eastern perimeter, a dark silhouette against the pale morning sky, and he was driving a fence post into the earth with a hand maul. Not an automated driver, not a pneumatic press. A hand maul, a heavy weighted instrument that converted nothing but biological leverage into compressive force. Nayland brought the skiff around in a slow arc and engaged the passive optics array, watching. Every strike was deliberate. The maul rose to precisely the same height each time, a beat of measured breath between each swing, and when it came down it landed on the post crown with a flat, perfect crack that carried clearly across the distance, even through the skiff's dampened hull. She watched him work through 17 strikes. On the 18th, the post ceded. He checked it with one hand, a brief lateral press, feeling for give, and moved to the next position without consulting a single display panel. Nayland's internal assessment protocols engaged automatically. She ran the geometry. The spacing between posts was consistent to within a margin that her own targeting overlays would have been proud of. There was no surveying rod, no measurement array, no weave link confirming the intervals. He had done it by eye. Her skiff stuttered. It was a minor thing, a harmonic fault in the port stabilizer vane that she had been filing maintenance requests about for 3 weeks. But the timing was, she would later reflect, fortuitous. The skiff dropped 6 feet of altitude in a single lurching second before the redundant system caught it, and the altitude alarm shrieked once through the cabin. Below her, the man on the ridge stopped mid-swing. He turned and looked directly at her, not at the general vicinity of her, not at the noise, but at the precise location of her hull against the sky, with the immediate and accurate spatial reading of something born to track moving objects. His eyes found her before her sensors had finished flagging her own position. Nayland stared at him through the optics array. He raised one hand in a greeting that was casual to the point of being almost dismissive. The wave of someone acknowledging a neighbor, not an alien vessel, and went back to his work. She set the skiff down on the ridge. The landing struts found purchase in the red clay with a hydraulic hiss, and Nayland sat for a moment in the sealed cabin, composing herself. It was a habit she had developed not out of anxiety, but out of discipline. A century of fieldwork had taught her that first impressions were data, and data was best collected in a state of calibrated neutrality. She ran a brief internal inventory. She was High Surveyor, 3rd tier, of the Ethelgard hegemony. She held the distinction of being the youngest entity ever appointed to that rank, appointed at age 42, which was still considered adolescent by Ethel developmental standards. She had since spent 61 years in the field. She had mapped the thermal architecture of dying stars, catalogued 17 new presentient species, and submitted 7,004 reports to the hegemony's central archives. Every one of those reports had been filed on time. Most had been filed early. She had not, in 61 years of fieldwork, found a single peer. The hegemony was not short on intelligence. Her colleagues were brilliant, many of them more formally educated than she was, carrying the deep institutional knowledge that came from spending one's formative decades in hegemony academies, rather than on atmospheric survey decks. But brilliance, she had come to understand, was not the same as what she was looking for. Her colleagues thought in structures that had been built for them. They used the weave the way lungs used air, not as a tool but as a precondition of function. Feed the weave a variable, receive an output, trust the output. Move to the next task. Naylin had stopped trusting outputs she hadn't derived herself sometime around her 35th year. She had begun to suspect, quietly and without sharing the suspicion with anyone, that there was a kind of thinking that the weave made impossible precisely because it made everything else so easy. A kind of processing that lived in the space between the question and the calculated answer, in the moment before certainty arrived. She had felt it herself occasionally, when the survey systems went down and she had to navigate by direct observation and raw inference. It felt like she stopped the inventory. The man outside had moved closer, working his way along the fence line toward her landing position, and she needed to be present for this. She unsealed the cabin and stepped out onto the clay. The air hit her immediately, thick with iron-rich particulates and the sharp resinous scent of something vegetable and wild. Her olfactory filters adjusted. The gravity was 1.15 standard. She felt it across her shoulders in the subtle way that all non-native gravity made itself known. Not heavy exactly, but honest, insistent. The planet refusing to pretend it was somewhere else. The human had stopped working. He was leaning on the long handle of his maul and watching her approach with an expression she classified, after a moment's analysis, as curious but unhurried. He was tall by human standards, though she still had nearly a foot of height on him. His face was broad and weathered, dark from long solar exposure, and his hands where they wrapped the maul handle were a geography of use. Every line and callus a record of force applied, repeated, refined. "Surveyor," he said. His voice was a low, carrying baritone. He had read the designation markings on her hull. "High Surveyor," she said, because precision mattered. "Naylin of the Ethelgard hegemony. Your stabilization grid has a scheduled review this quarter. I was passing on a secondary route when my skiff developed a minor fault." She paused. Her feline ears tilted slightly forward, an involuntary tell she had never fully suppressed. "You are?" "Rory," he said. He didn't offer a family designation, a colonial registration number, or a professional title. He just offered his name, as though that were sufficient, and reached into the breast pocket of his work jacket to produce a thermos. "Coffee?" She looked at the thermos. "I don't consume." "Fair enough." He poured a measure into the thermos cap anyway and drank it standing, watching her with the same unhurried attention he had been giving the fence line. "Your stabilizer's been intermittent for a while, sounds like. Heard your dampeners struggling against that oscillation on your approach vector." Naylin's ears went very still. "You identified the fault by sound," she said. "Port vein," he said. "Harmonic irregularity. It's not catastrophic. Sounds like a minor oscillation imbalance. But you probably want to look at the mounting bracket before it gets worse." She stared at him. He finished his coffee and picked up his maul. "What are you building?" Naylin asked. She had, by this point, decided to stay. This was not an impulsive decision. She had weighed it against her scheduled survey itinerary, assessed the skiff's condition. Rory's diagnosis of the port vein had been, her subsequent diagnostic confirmed, entirely accurate, and concluded that a maintenance delay was both operationally justified and scientifically warranted. She also concluded, in a separate and more private column of reasoning, that she was not ready to leave. "Inertia wire fence," Rory said. He was crouched over a spool of dense metallic cable, walking it out along the post line with the easy efficiency of someone who had done this particular task many hundreds of times. "Perimeter security for the eastern pasture. The inertia wire runs through tension brackets on each post. If anything heavy enough hits the line, the tension differential triggers a proximity alarm at the station." "A mechanical alarm system," Naylin said. "Yep." "Not a weave-integrated sensor net." He glanced up at her. "The weave's got dead zones out here when the solar wind is active. Mechanical doesn't have dead zones." He stood, feeding the wire through the bracket on the nearest post with practiced ease. "Also doesn't need a firmware update." Naylin watched him work the wire through the bracket and engage the tension lock. He was doing it without looking. His eyes were on the next post down the line, already calculating the run, while his hands finished the work on the current bracket from what appeared to be pure tactile memory. "How do you determine when the wire is correctly tensioned?" she asked. "Feel," he said. "Elaborate." He paused and looked at her. Something in her tone, she had worked very hard over decades to modulate the hyper-precision of it in fieldwork contexts, with mixed success, seemed to register with him as genuine curiosity rather than condescension. He held out the free end of the wire toward her. "Here, hold this." She took it. The wire was thicker than it appeared from a distance, cold and slightly rough against her palm. She could feel the weight of the spool's remaining length in the subtle pull of it. "Now," Rory said, moving to the next post and threading the wire through its bracket. "Close your hand around it and pay attention to the vibration." "There is no vibration. The line is slack." "Exactly. That's what slack feels like. Now watch." He engaged the tensioner, a manual ratcheting tool with a long handle that he braced against his thigh, and began to apply load to the line. Naylin felt it immediately through her palm. Not a sound, not a visible change in the wire. A sensation, the subtle alteration of the line from something inert into something alive with stored force. The physics of tension translating directly into a frequency she could feel in the bones of her hand. She held very still. He worked the ratchet in slow, even increments. The frequency in her palm climbed, a fine, high vibration that was almost a hum without being audible, and she found herself tracking it the way she tracked spectral data from her onboard sensors, watching for the inflection point where the tone would change character. "There," Rory said, and stopped. "How did you know?" she asked. "The tone shifts when it hits optimal tension, goes from a kind of shimmer to a flat note. You can feel the difference in your palm even if you can't hear it. Do it enough times, and your hands just know." He took the wire end back from her. "Any more past that point and you start fatiguing the metal at the bracket anchor." Naylin looked at her palm. She could still feel the ghost of the vibration in it. "Your species evolved this sensitivity," she said, and she meant it as a technical observation, but it came out with something else in it, something closer to wonder, and she was aware of her ears tilting forward again. "We used to build everything this way," Rory said. He had moved on to the next bracket, hands working without instruction from any interface. Before any of the automated tools, somebody had to know what right felt like. He looked at her sidelong, and his expression had a quality of dry, private amusement that she was having difficulty categorizing. "Turns out your hands remember things a long time after your brain stops paying attention." Naylin filed this observation in a new column she had not anticipated needing when she landed her skiff on this ridge. She stayed for the next 3 posts. By midday, she had stopped observing and started helping. This was not planned. The transition happened in the way that genuine transitions tended to happen, gradually enough that there was no single moment she could identify as a decision, and then completely. One moment she was standing to one side of the fence line, watching and taking internal notes with the systematic detachment of a career field researcher. The next moment she had one gloved hand on a tension bracket and was holding the housing open while Rory fed the inertia wire through with the precision of someone threading a needle in high wind, because a wind had in fact come up off the plateau and the cable was fighting it. "Keep the angle flat," he said. "Don't let it bow up." "I am not letting it bow up." "You're letting it bow up a little." Her ears flicked back. She adjusted her grip, reading the resistance in the line, and the angle corrected. She felt the point of correction through the bracket housing before she saw it. "Better," Rory said, with the tone of someone who was not particularly surprised by this, but was noting it anyway. And something about his calm matter-of-factness was more satisfying than praise would have been. They worked through 6 more posts before the wind shifted and the temperature on the plateau dropped by 3 degrees in under a minute. Naylin's thermal sensors registered it before her skin did, which was not true for Rory. She saw him register the change first in the slight alteration of his breathing, a slowed, deliberate exhale, before he glanced at the western sky with the practiced eye of someone reading weather by the old methods. "Storm system coming over the ridge," he said. "Not for a few hours. We've got time." She had not told him she had thermal sensors. He had read the weather from the wind and the quality of the light. "You've been on Oakhaven a long time," she said. It was not quite a question. "Born here," he said. "3rd generation. My grandfather broke the first ground on this property." He drove another post into the red clay with 3 strikes of the maul, a sequence that she had now observed enough times to recognize was always exactly 3 strikes on hardpack, and checked it with that brief lateral press. "You've been out on survey for 100 years? 61 active field years," she corrected. "The century accounts for transit time and administrative periods. Long time to be looking for something." She processed this. She had not told him she was looking for anything. He had arrived at that inference through a different channel entirely, and she was not accustomed to being read by people who weren't ethel, and she was not always accustomed to being read this accurately by people who were. The hegemony conducts routine surveys of all outer system colonies, she said. Sure, Rory said. He was watching the line level on the next run of wire, one eye closed against the wind. He did not press the point. She found this restraint unexpectedly comfortable. Most people she encountered, ethel or otherwise, filled silence with more words. It was a near-universal social behavior she had catalogued and found exhausting. Rory seemed to understand that silence was a working condition, not a problem to be solved, and he operated in it with the ease of a man who had learned a long time ago that the earth didn't talk and didn't need it to. They finished the eastern stretch of the line as the light began to turn gold over the plateau, long shadows running out from the post line across the red clay. Rory examined the completed run. 72 meters of inertia wire, 18 posts, every bracket seated and tensioned. And then he examined it with his hands, walking the line from post to post with 2 fingers resting lightly on the wire, reading it like a text. Good, he said when he reached the end. Nayland had run her own assessment simultaneously, using the passive field mapping sensors in her suit. Her result was the same. The run was within tolerance she would have considered professional by any standard she had encountered. She had filed this observation in the column that was getting longer. There is a subharmonic in the 3rd bracket from the south end, she said. Not significant, but it will dampen the alarm sensitivity by approximately 4% if left uncorrected. Rory walked back to the 3rd bracket, rested his palm flat on the post, and was still for 2 seconds. Yeah, he said. Mounting slightly off true. Take me 5 minutes. He produced a small wrench from his jacket pocket and went to work. Nayland stood in the golden light on the Oak Haven Ridge and understood, with the particular clarity that only arrived when something had been approaching for a long time and finally got there, that she was going to find reasons to stay longer than the skiff fault warranted. She felt it first through the soles of her boots. It was late afternoon. They had moved on to the southern segment of the fence line, working into the lower ground where the clay gave way to a looser, more composite soil threaded with dark mineral striations. The terrain was less cooperative here, softer underfoot in places, with small subsidence pockets that the post needed to be set deeper to account for. And Rory had adjusted his technique accordingly, angling the maul strikes slightly and packing the post bases with aggregate stone he carried in the truck bed. Nayland was learning, by close observation, to read the difference between a well-seated post and one that needed additional packing, and she was filing the methodology with growing interest when the vibration came. Low, rhythmic. Below the threshold of hearing, below even the threshold of what she would normally classify as sensation. More like a fact about the ground than anything she was receiving through normal sensory channels. Her boots were good equipment, standard hegemony issue survey grade, with passive haptic feedback arrays that she rarely consulted, because the data they returned was almost always redundant. She consulted them now. The arrays were returning null. Nayland frowned. The vibration persisted. She increased the haptic sensitivity threshold incrementally, 10%, 20, 40, and the arrays continued to return null, which meant the vibration she was feeling was not only below the threshold of her standard equipment, but also below the floor of her enhanced sensitivity settings. It was a signal that should not, technically, be registering in her nervous system at all. He had stopped working. He was crouched on one knee, his bare right hand flat on the soil. He had removed his work glove, she realized, at some point in the last minute that she had not consciously clocked, and his expression was a quality she had not yet seen on him. Not alarmed, not uncertain, focused in a way that was different from his ordinary working focus, more total, more animal. Rory, she said. 1 second. She waited. The vibration moved through her boots in that deep subsurface pulse, regular, with a cadence that her pattern recognition systems flagged as biological the moment she applied that filter. Not geological, not mechanical. Biological rhythm, at a scale that implied significant mass. Void shifter, Rory said. Nayland's golden eyes swept to her scanner readout. The void shifter was listed in the Oak Haven Colony's fauna registry as a theoretical hazard. Subterranean apex predator, Class 7 biomass, Last confirmed sighting 7 years prior in the northern basin, 40 kilometers from this ridge. Her scanners showed clear terrain, no subsurface mass signature, no bioelectric source. My scanners show nothing, she said. Your scanners are looking for a solid mass. Rory stood slowly, not lifting his hand from the ground until the last moment. Void shifter liquefies the substrate as it moves. It isn't reading as a discrete object. It's reading as slightly wrong soil. He turned and looked southwest, toward the colony's main structure cluster. His jaw was set. It's close. And it's moving toward the pylon cluster. The stabilization pylons, Nayland said. Yeah. She cross-referenced the pylon placement against the biorhythm interval she had been tracking through her boots. The heading matched. The void shifter, if Rory's diagnosis was correct, and she had stopped discounting his diagnoses after the port vein, was on a direct approach vector toward the colony's primary tectonic stabilization infrastructure. We should contact the colony station, she said, already opening a comm channel on her suit. Already ahead of you, Rory said. He had a handheld transmitter out, a physical, hardwired unit, not a weave link, and was speaking into it with calm, clipped efficiency. Station, this is Rory on the south fence. I need you to get non-essential personnel into the reinforced structures now. We've got a shifter moving toward the pylon cluster. Move. A pause, a voice Nayland couldn't fully parse. Then Rory said, I know what my hands tell me. Move. And clipped the transmitter shut. He looked at Nayland. You said you have survey equipment on your skiff, he said. Significant survey equipment, yes. Can it run a manual interface with the pylon maintenance network? She processed this. The pylon's maintenance network was an old system, pre-weave integration, installed in the colony's first decade when the infrastructure budget had been limited and the engineers had built-in redundancies designed for physical access rather than remote management. She had noted it in her preliminary survey scan as a legacy system, mildly interesting from an infrastructural archaeology standpoint. Yes, she said, but a manual interface would require. I know what it requires, Rory said. He was already moving toward his truck. Let's go. The ground moved for the first time as they came down off the ridge. It was not a dramatic thing. The plateau didn't crack or heave. The red clay simply shuddered once, with the unmistakable quality of something vast adjusting its position beneath the skin of the world. And then the stillness that followed was not the ordinary stillness of a quiet afternoon, but the held-breath stillness of a system under load. Nayland processed this with the part of her mind that was always processing and said nothing. The other part of her mind, the part that was more accurately described as the rest of her, felt the cold, clean shock of being cut off from the weave. It happened between one step and the next. The void shifter's bioelectric field, she understood in retrospect, worked on a frequency that the weave's sensor architecture had never been designed to filter, because no one had ever thought to design for it. The colony's weave integration was not a target. It was collateral. The shifter was not disrupting the network deliberately. It was simply generating a field in the course of being what it was, and the weave, encountering a signal it had no protocol to process, did what overloaded systems always did. It shut down. Nayland stopped walking. She had not anticipated this response in herself. She was not, she would have told you, dependent on the weave in the way her colleagues were dependent on it. She had spent more field hours operating in low connectivity conditions than almost any other high surveyor of her generation, and she had always been quietly proud of her capacity for autonomous reasoning. But there was a difference, she discovered now, between low connectivity and complete severance, in the same way there was a difference between dim light and true darkness. When the weave dropped out entirely, she did not simply lose access to a processing tool. She lost the constant background signal that her nervous system had been calibrating against since infancy. A reference tone, subaudible, ever-present, and the silence where it had been was not neutral. It was disorienting in a way that she had no good internal vocabulary for. Rory was 3 strides ahead of her before he noticed she had stopped. He turned and looked at her, and his assessment was quick and not unkind. The weave's down, he said. Yes. First time it's gone out completely on you? Yes. He came back to her. He did not touch her. He stopped at a respectful distance. But he put himself in her line of sight in a way that gave her something immediate and concrete to focus on. And she understood this was intentional. It's just quiet, he said. You already know everything you need to know. The weave wasn't doing your thinking. It was just confirming it. You don't need the confirmation. She looked at him. The ground shuddered again, longer this time. And in the middle distance she could see the uppermost structure of Pylon 2, beginning to list very slightly to the east. Not catastrophically, not yet, but with the deliberate, incremental tilt of a foundation compromised at depth. The tectonic stabilization sequence requires simultaneous actuation of 3 manual override points, she said. Her voice was steady. The processing had come back online, pulled back into focus by necessity, the way a muscle responds when the body demands it, regardless of discomfort. Separated by 40 meters, one operator cannot manage all 3 in sequence before the actuation window closes. I know, Rory said. That's why there are 2 of us. He started moving again. I'll handle the physical actuation. You run the timing. You need the mechanical override key for the gear assembly. He patted his jacket pocket. Had it on me when I heard the shifter. Habit. He glanced back at her, and in the waning afternoon light, his expression carried something she would have difficulty categorizing even later, when she had more time to examine it. I fix things for a living. I carry the tools. She followed him. The ground shuddered a third time as they reached the service road that ran along the pylon cluster perimeter. And this time, it did not stop. It settled into a continuous low tremor, the substrate in the process of liquefying as the void shifter moved through it, and the air above the southern pasture hazed faintly as particulate matter sifted up through fault lines in the clay. Pylon 2 was listing 3 degrees east. The automated stabilization routines, deprived of their weave connection, had locked into fail-safe mode. They were doing nothing. They were waiting for an instruction that was not coming. How long before it compromises the foundation anchor? Nayland asked. 20 minutes if the liquefaction stays localized, Rory said. Maybe 12 if it spreads. The manual actuation window for a 3-point reset is 90 seconds once you initiate, he said. He said it the way she would have said it, from direct knowledge, not from looking it up. So we need to start in the next 4. She was already running the geometry. The primary pylon's maintenance access panel was on the north face, which was, by the grace of the shifter's current vector, the face that had not yet begun to shift with the liquefying substrate. Nayland reached it first, her longer stride covering the last 50 meters faster than Rory's, and she had the manual interface housing open and the legacy terminal active before he caught up. The terminal was old, genuinely old. It used vacuum tube logic and heavy lead shielding, primitive enough to be invisible to the shifter's bioelectric interference. Her survey experience with pre-weave infrastructure meant she recognized the interface architecture, but she had not worked with hardware this vintage in nearly 30 years. Physical input pads, mechanical confirmation locks, a timing display that ran on an independent battery system. The gear assembly is below the access panel, Rory said, arriving beside her. He was opening the equipment bag he had pulled from the truck bed, and from it he removed his heavy-duty fence tensioner, the same tool she had watched him use on the inertia wire that morning, a lifetime ago, and a manual override key, antique in design, the kind of tool machined to tolerances that assumed a skilled human hand rather than an automated system. That tensioner is for wire work, Nayland said, and gear actuation, if you get the angle right. He crouched at the base of the pylon housing, pulling a secondary access panel, and she could see the gear assembly inside. 3 interlocking mechanical drums that, when manually advanced to the correct position and held there under load, would trigger the override reset sequence. The gear's got a resistance of about 400 kilograms at full load. The tensioner gives me enough mechanical advantage to seat it by hand. He looked up at her. I need you on the timing. The 3-point actuation has to be sequential within a 2-second window. First actuation starts the clock. Understood. She was already parsing the terminal logic, the old command architecture assembling itself in her mind with the orderly precision that was her native mode of thought. The second and third actuation points are at Pylon 3 and Pylon 1, south and north, 40 meters each direction. He was threading the tensioner into the gear assembly mounting bracket, the movements deft and economical. Can you run to Pylon 3 and back to 1 in under 8 minutes while maintaining the timing sequence? She looked at the distances. She looked at her suit's terrain data. She looked at the degree of ground liquefaction between the pylon positions. The substrate was compromised in a rough crescent east of the main cluster, but the service road running north-south remained solid. "I can do it in 70 seconds, she said. Rory looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration of some internal setting. "Okay," he said. "Then we have margin." He positioned the tensioner. "On your call." Nayland's hands went to the primary terminal. She felt the mechanical keys under her fingers. Physical keys, not haptic surfaces, with the distinct positive click resistance of components designed to be operated by feel in adverse conditions. And she understood suddenly, with the clarity of something she should have understood years ago, that this was the design philosophy her civilization had abandoned. Not because it was primitive, because it was slow, because it required a person to be physically present, physically skilled, physically committed. It could not be delegated to a weave process. It had to be done by hand. The ground shuddered hard beneath her feet. "Nayland," Rory said, steady. "Ready," she said. "On your call." She ran the final calculation, the clock in her mind, not a weave clock, her own clock. The one she had been running inside her own processing for 61 years without always knowing that was what she was doing. Counted down the actuation window against the estimated liquefaction spread rate against the 3-degree pylon incline, and the time it would take Rory to seat the gear under 400 kilograms of resistance. "Initiate," she said. Rory drove the tensioner. The gear assembly screamed with the deep metallic voice of a mechanism that had not been asked to do anything for a very long time. And Nayland was already moving, one hand leaving the terminal in a trailing contact that fed her the sensor data she needed through her fingertips for another 3 seconds before she broke contact and ran. The service road was solid beneath her, 40 meters. Pylon 3's panel was open in 4 seconds. Her fingers found the actuation key in the dark by shape, and she seated the second lock at 40 seconds into the window. She was already running north. She heard the void shifter before she saw it. The subharmonic groan that preceded its emergence was not loud. It was the kind of sound that made you understand, viscerally, why early humans had built their fear responses around subsurface predators. A sound that entered through the sternum, rather than the ear, that said something enormous is coming and the ground is not between you and it. She was 40 meters from Pylon 1, with 15 seconds remaining in the actuation window, when the earth between Pylon 2 and the southern pasture bulged upward and split. The void shifter came through. It was bigger than the registry entry had prepared her for. Class 7 biomass was a number. The reality of the thing was a different category of information entirely. The obsidian armor plating rose from the churning soil in plates the size of structural hull sections, segmented and overlapping, and the creature's forward mass as it breached was oriented toward Rory's position at the primary pylon by the same bioelectric sensitivity that had been disrupting the weave, drawn to the gear assembly's mechanical activity like something tracking a heartbeat. Rory saw it coming, later reviewing the event in her memory with the systematic thoroughness she applied to all significant field data. Nayland would note that the speed of his response was the thing, not the courage. She had catalogued courage in many species, and it was common, if not universal, but the speed, and more specifically, the quality of the speed. He did not start moving after he assessed the threat. He started moving as he assessed it, the reaction and the analysis occurring in what appeared, from the outside, to be a single continuous event. He pulled a structural support beam from the pylon maintenance scaffold. Heavy gauge composite, roughly 3 meters, designed to hold several tons of lateral load, and he positioned it between himself and the shifter's forward arc with the calm, precise placement of someone installing a door frame. Then he braced it. Weight low, spine straight, both hands on the beam with the specific grip geometry she had watched him use on the fence tensioner that morning. Not a panicked hold, but a working hold. The hold of someone who understood load distribution from the inside out. The shifter hit the beam. The impact was enormous. She felt it in the ground 20 meters away. The beam held because Rory held it. His human skeletal density and the specific mechanics of his braced stance converting the creature's kinetic force downward into the earth rather than backward. And the shifter's forward advance stopped for the 3 seconds it needed to recalibrate. Nayland reached Pylon 1's panel. Her hands found the actuation key. 7 minutes, 44 seconds, 16 seconds remaining. She felt the gear housing's resistance, the same resistance she had learned to read through her palms that morning on the fence line. And she knew from that reading that the lock was seated correctly at the first 3/4 of rotation and incorrectly for the final quarter turn. A misalignment of some small degree, a consequence of decades of disuse, that would cause the actuation to fail if she completed the rotation as the mechanism intended. She would need to over-rotate by 11 degrees and allow the spring detent to pull it back. She knew this the way she knew the subharmonic frequency of a correctly tensioned wire, not from a readout, from the resistance in her fingers and a mind that had been paying attention all day. She completed the rotation. The actuation locked. The terminal display at the base of the pylon, the old battery-independent display running on its own circuit, turned green. Behind her, the void shifter emitted its subsurface groan and receded. The bioelectric field began to dissipate as it withdrew below the liquefied substrate, and across the colony's infrastructure, the weave began its restart sequence in a cascading series of quiet, procedural tones. Nayland stood at the terminal and breathed. After a moment, she walked back to Pylon 2. Rory was leaning against the maintenance scaffold, the support beam back in its housing. He was looking at his hands. "Pylon's locked," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I heard the tone." He looked up at her. "Good timing." The third actuation required an 11-degree over-rotation, she said. The spring detent was offset. He was quiet for a moment. "I would have felt that," he said, "if I'd been the one on the terminal." "I know," she said. "I did feel it." He looked at her. In the fading afternoon light, his face was readable in a way she was still developing the vocabulary for. Open, without performance, carrying something she had not often encountered in a century of professional interaction. "That was well done," he said. She met his eyes. "We did it together," she said, and meant it with a precision that surprised her. The Colony Station medical team arrived 18 minutes after the void shifter retreated. They were efficient and thorough, and Nayland submitted to the biofield exposure assessment with patient compliance, because it was the correct procedure, and because she needed the 6 minutes of enforced stillness that the assessment required. She spent those 6 minutes processing. She had been processing since the moment at the Pylon 1 terminal, when the 11-degree offset had resolved itself through her fingers instead of through a sensor readout. And she had completed the actuation not by knowing it, not by calculating it from a data source external to herself, but by feeling the mechanics of it from the inside, the way the mechanism needed to move, with the same direct physical comprehension she had watched Rory demonstrate all day in a dozen different forms. She had spent 61 field years learning to trust her own processing over the weave's conformations. She had not known until today that the processing she was trusting was the same processing as his. She had called it logic. She had called it inference. She had called it 60 years of accumulated domain knowledge. It was intuition, the same thing, a different name, applied by a civilization that had developed it through neural architecture rather than sensory-motor training, but the same underlying phenomenon, a mind processing more variables than it could consciously enumerate, and arriving at the correct answer ahead of the formal methodology. The medical assessment cleared her. She thanked the technician, a young human woman who looked at her with the wide-eyed expression Nayland was accustomed to generating in people who did not often encounter Ethel at close range, and walked back out to the east compound where Rory was helping 2 colony engineers inspect the pylon foundations. She waited. He finished with the engineers, answered their questions with the same unhurried economy he applied to everything, and then walked over to her. He had found time, somewhere in the preceding 18 minutes, to wash the worst of the clay and gear grease from his hands, though not all of it. His palms still carried the dark lines that had been there when she first saw him on the ridge, the permanent record of his work. "Pylon foundations are intact," he said. "The substrate liquefaction didn't penetrate below the anchor depth. We got lucky with the timing." "We were not lucky with the timing," Nayland said. "We calculated the timing." The corner of his mouth moved. "Fair point." She was quiet for a moment. The medical team was packing their equipment in the background. The weave was running smoothly now, its signals present and steady around her like a return tide. And she found she was noticing it as a thing separate from herself, a tool she was choosing to hold rather than a condition she existed within. "When the void shifter was approaching your position," she said, "you called a tension variable before I reached the third actuation point. You gave me a number." Rory nodded. "The beam load at the shifter contact point. I needed you to know whether the scaffold would hold if the shifter hit it a second time." The number you gave me was 4,300 kilograms over the beam's rated maximum, she said. Yeah, my independent calculation was 4,312 kilograms. He looked at her steadily. He was not surprised. He was not performing the modesty that she had observed many highly competent individuals deploy when confronted with evidence of their own precision, a social behavior she had always found irritating in its suggestion that excellence needed to be disguised. He simply received the information as information. Gut math, he said. There is no such thing as gut math, Nayland said. There is calculation, and there is calculation that has been automatized through enough repetition that the conscious mind is no longer aware of performing it. The result is identical. The processing is identical. The instrument is different. He was quiet. The last light of the Oakhaven day was going from gold to something deeper, and the ridge above the east compound was a dark line against a sky that was beginning to show the first of the colony's 2 moons. That what you've been looking for? He asked. All this time out here? Nayland looked at him for a long moment, looked at his calloused hands and his weathered face, and the quality of patient attention with which he returned her gaze, and gave him the only answer that was accurate. Yes, she said, and I have found it in a completely unexpected place. He looked at the fence line on the ridge above them, one stretch of completed inertia wire glinting faintly in the last of the light. Funny, he said. I've been right here the whole time. They went back to the fence at first light. There was no formal agreement about this. When Nayland woke in the skiff's crew berth at the first brightening of the eastern sky, she conducted her morning system check, noted that the stabilizer vane mounting bracket had been repaired. She had found, on returning to the skiff the previous evening, that someone had tightened the mounting with a standard wrench, and the vibration was gone. And then she walked up the service track to the ridge, because that was the direction her reasoning pointed. Rory was already there. He had a thermos and 2 cups this time, which she took as either foresight or routine, and decided it didn't matter which. Skiff's running quieter, he said, without preamble. You repaired the vane mount. Figured I was in the area. He handed her a cup. She had already determined she did not consume human coffee, but she took the cup anyway, wrapping both hands around its warmth. Because the morning was cold on the plateau, and the gesture was one of those simple human ones that carried meaning, the Ethel tended to pack into far more formal structures. They looked at the completed fence in the early light. It was, she reflected, a good fence. The post line was clean and true. The inertia wire running level through each bracket with the flat held precision of a line drawn with intention. The third bracket from the south end, the one with the off-true mounting, had been corrected. The whole run had the quality of work that had been done with full attention and would hold for a long time because of it. I have a survey report to file, Nayland said. The pylon incident will require a full incident documentation. The void shifter incursion into the primary stabilization cluster represents a significant gap in the colony's fauna hazard assessment. Probably right, Rory said. It will take several days. He looked at her. The gold of her eyes caught the early light in a way she was distantly aware was visible to human perception, and she did not look away from his assessment of it. You're welcome to use the East Compound Survey Station, he said. It's got a weave uplink, power, the usual. My grandmother's kitchen table has better coffee than the station canteen, if that matters. I don't consume human coffee, she said. I know, but you hold the cup. He said it without mockery, straightforward, observational, and she found that she was not annoyed by being observed accurately. She found the opposite of that. My grandmother also makes something called spiced grain tea that she insists is a universal solvent for everything from hypothermia to existential uncertainty. She grew up on hegemony-adjacent territory, knows a few Ethel brewing customs. Nayland looked at the fence. She looked at the first of Oakhaven's 2 suns clearing the edge of the plateau, the light spreading across the red clay in long, warm bands that turned the world briefly from red to something closer to gold. She had spent a century, by her own accounting, looking for a mind that matched her own particular frequency of processing, the kind that didn't need the weave to confirm what it already knew, that could read the physics of a system through its own materials, that arrived at the right answer by whatever path worked and didn't apologize for the route. She had looked in the hegemony's academies and its field programs and its diplomatic corps. She had looked in the human universities she had passed through on transit stops, in the pre-weave archives of a dozen civilizations, in the work of engineers and navigators and theorists and architects. She had found him on a ridge on a Death World colony, fixing a fence by hand. She thought about telling him this, and then thought better of it. Not because it was untrue, but because it was the kind of thing that could be said better over time than in a single moment. And she was coming to understand time. The survey report would take days. The void shifter incident required follow-up. The colony's pylon maintenance protocols needed revision, which she was arguably best positioned to oversee. She had legitimate professional reasons to stay for 2 weeks, possibly 3, and she was not going to examine the legitimacy of those reasons too closely. "I would like to try the tea," she said. Rory finished his coffee and picked up his equipment bag. The fence didn't need more work. It was done. But she had already noticed there was a section of the western perimeter that had been flagged on the colony's maintenance schedule, visible in the survey data she had pulled the previous evening while writing her initial incident notes. "West section needs another 40 meters of wire," she said. "I noticed it on the maintenance log." He looked at the western slope, assessing the terrain with that direct, immediate spatial reading that she was done categorizing as anything other than what it was. "Harder ground out there," he said. "Takes a little longer. Better to do it right." "I have time," Nayland said. He looked at her. The morning light was full on the ridge now, and the fence line ran straight and clean between them and the horizon, and he had the expression of someone who had not been expecting something and had gotten it anyway and was quietly fine with that. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." They picked up the wire spool together and walked toward the western slope, and the red world opened out ahead of them, vast and honest and patient, the way good ground always was. And that brings us to the end of today's story. Thanks for taking the time to listen. I really appreciate it. This channel is all about original human-focused science fiction, and every story is presented as a part of a larger collection. If you'd like to continue, there's another story from this channel